Enchained by the hunt. Kasha Wren had spent her life running from something she couldn't name. Her mother had warned her never look too long at the full moon, never step past the old iron gates, never listen to the wind when it called her name. But when she stumbled upon the abandoned shrine in the forest, the carved stones still slick with fresh rain, she felt at the end of the chase. The shadows shifted, and a figure emerged, golden-eyed and waiting. "You've been running all your life," he murmured. "But the hunt always catches what belongs to it." Chapter 1. The Scent of Rain and Fear. The petrichor was almost overwhelming, clinging to the air like a shroud. Kasha Wren inhaled deeply, the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves a familiar comfort, a stark contrast to the knot of unease twisting in her gut. She was 58, her hair more silver than brown these days, threaded with the ghosts of anxieties she'd carried for a lifetime. Each raindrop that splattered against the ancient, gnarled oaks surrounding her seemed to whisper a warning, a refrain she'd heard since childhood. "Don't linger. Don't look. Don't listen." Her mother's voice, though silenced by death these past 15 years, echoed in the rustling leaves. "Never look too long at the full moon, Kasha. Never step past the old iron gates. Never listen to the wind when it calls your name." Superstitions, Kasha had always believed, the ramblings of a woman broken by a grief she'd never named. Yet, here Kasha was, drawn to the very edge of the forbidden, her sensible walking boots sinking slightly into the muddy trail. The town of Silver Creek, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, was a place of whispers and secrets. It was a place where the mundane and the extraordinary blurred, where the line between reality and folklore was as thin as the mist that often clung to the peaks. Kasha had returned after decades of self-imposed exile, drawn back by the unsettling feeling that something was unfinished. Her mother's cottage, perched on the outskirts of town, near the sprawling, neglected Blackwood estate, felt both welcoming and menacing. She'd spent her life running, moving from city to city, job to job, relationship to relationship, always with the nagging sense that something was chasing her. A shadow, a feeling, a premonition she couldn't articulate, even to herself. Now, back in the place where it all began, the feeling was stronger than ever, a palpable weight pressing down on her chest. The rain intensified, plastering strands of her hair to her forehead. She pulled her worn woolen scarf tighter, her gaze drawn to the overgrown path that veered off the main trail. It led, she knew, to the Blackwood estate, a place locals avoided, a place steeped in legend and whispered tales of tragedy. Her mother had warned her about Blackwood, about the family that had once lived there, about the darkness that had consumed them. A shiver traced its way down Kasha's spine, a sensation that had nothing to do with the chill of the rain. It was a primal fear, an instinct honed over years of unspoken dread. Yet, a counter-instinct, a yearning for answers, pulled her forward. She found herself taking a tentative step onto the overgrown path, then another. The air grew heavy, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out to her. Kasha paused, her hand instinctively going to the small, silver locket she wore around her neck, a gift from her mother. It was cool to the touch, a tangible link to the woman who had both protected and terrified her. Inside was a single, faded photograph of a man Kasha had never known her father. A man her mother had refused to speak of, a man whose absence had been a constant, unspoken presence in their lives. As she moved deeper into the woods, the light dimmed, filtered through the dense canopy. The scent of pine mingled with the damp earth, creating an almost intoxicating aroma. Kasha felt a strange pull, a sense of familiarity, as if she'd walked this path before, in a dream, or perhaps a past life. The thought was absurd, yet it lingered, unsettling her. She rounded a bend in the path, and then she saw it, an abandoned shrine, nestled amongst the trees, almost hidden by the encroaching vegetation. It was small, constructed of weathered stone, covered in moss and lichen. The carving above the arched entrance was barely discernible, depicting a wolf howling at the moon. A shiver, colder than the rain, snaked through her. It was a symbol she'd seen before, in her mother's hidden journals, scrawled alongside frantic warnings and cryptic passages. Kasha approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The stone was slick with fresh rain, the water pooling in the hollows of the carving. She reached out, her fingers tracing the outline of the wolf, a strange sense of recognition washing over her. It was as if the stone itself was alive, pulsing with a hidden energy. Suddenly, the shadows shifted. Not the natural movement of light and darkness, but a deliberate, almost sentient motion. Kasha froze, her breath catching in her throat. A figure emerged from the deeper shadows of the shrine, stepping into the dim light. Tall, imposing, silhouetted against the rain-streaked trees. He was breathtaking. Not in a conventional sense, but with a raw, untamed beauty that bypassed logic and went straight to something primal within her. His hair was dark, almost black, falling to his shoulders in thick waves. His eyes were golden, like molten honey, and they held a depth of knowing that made her breath hitch. They seemed to see straight through her, to the core of her being, to the fear and the yearning she had tried so hard to bury. He stood there unmoving, a predator assessing its prey, yet there was a strange stillness about him, a sense of waiting. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable tension that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Then he spoke, his voice a low rumble that resonated deep within her bones, a sound that seemed to bypass her ears and go straight to her soul. "You've been running all your life," he murmured, his gaze unwavering. "But the hunt always catches what belongs to it." His words hung in the air, not a threat, but a pronouncement, a declaration of something inevitable. Kasha could only stare, and to what did she belong? Chapter 2. Whispers beyond the iron gates. Kasha couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy, charged with an energy she couldn't comprehend. The man-no creature felt more appropriate before her radiated an ancient power, a wildness that both terrified and intrigued her. His words, "But the hunt always catches what belongs to it," echoed in her mind, sending shivers down her spine. Belongs? To what, or to whom, did she belong? She wanted to run, to flee back to the relative safety of her mother's cottage, to the familiar world of logic and reason. But her feet felt rooted to the spot, her body betraying her mind's desperate pleas for escape. Her gaze remained locked with his, those golden eyes holding her captive. They were the eyes of a wolf, she realized with a jolt, yet they held an intelligence, a sadness, that was undeniably human. Who are you?" She managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The rain continued to fall, a steady rhythm against the backdrop of her escalating fear. He didn't answer immediately. He simply watched her, his gaze intense, studying her as if searching for something within her, something hidden even from herself. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rustling of the leaves and the distant rumble of thunder. Finally, he took a step closer, and Kasha instinctively flinched. He stopped, a flicker of something that might have been regret crossing his features. "My name is Reese," he said, his voice still low, but with a subtle shift in tone, a hint of gentleness. "Reese Blackwood." The name struck her like a physical blow. Blackwood. The name her mother had warned her about, the name associated with darkness and tragedy. The name that had haunted the whispers of Silver Creek for generations. She remembered the old iron gates, rusted and imposing, that marked the entrance to the Blackwood estate, the gates her mother had forbidden her to cross. "You're from," she stammered, unable to complete the sentence. He nodded slowly, his golden eyes never leaving hers. "From the family that once owned this land," he confirmed. "The family that vanished." The word vanished hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The local legends spoke of a curse, of a family consumed by a darkness they couldn't control, of a tragedy that had left the estate abandoned and haunted. Kasha had always dismissed them as folklore, as the exaggerated tales of a superstitious town. But looking at Reese Blackwood, standing before her in the rain-soaked ruins of the old shrine, she felt a chilling certainty that the legends held a grain of truth, perhaps more than a grain. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. What do you mean? The hunt. Rhys looked away for the first time, his gaze shifting to the carved wolf above the shrine entrance. It's an old story, he said, his voice laced with a weariness that seemed to span centuries. A story of a bond, a connection, that transcends time and death. A story of werewolves. Kasha's mind reeled. Werewolves? It was absurd. Yet, the look in his eyes, the intensity of his presence, the strange energy that crackled in the air around him, it all pointed to something beyond the realm of the ordinary. She remembered the full moon warnings, the strange dreams that had plagued her for years, dreams of running through forests, of being pursued by a shadow with golden eyes. My mother, she warned me, Kasha whispered, her voice thick with emotion.
She warned me about you.
About Blackwood. Rhys turned back to her, his expression softening. Your mother knew, he said, his voice a low murmur. She knew more than she let on. She tried to protect you, to keep you away from your destiny. Destiny? Kasha echoed, the word feeling alien and terrifying. What destiny? I don't want any part of this. He took another step closer, and this time, Kasha didn't flinch. There was a strange pull, a magnetic force drawing her to him, despite her fear. It's not a choice, Kasha, he said, his voice laced with a sorrow that resonated deep within her. It's a legacy, a bloodline, a bond that was forged long before you were born. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, a heat that seemed to defy the chill of the rain. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm against the steady beat of the rain. Don't be afraid, he said, his voice a soft caress. I won't hurt you. His fingertips brushed against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It wasn't a threatening sensation, but an awakening. Something deep within her stirred, a dormant part of her soul recognizing something in him, something ancient and familiar. He lowered his hand, his gaze searching hers. You feel it, don't you? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The pull. The connection. Kasha couldn't deny it. She did feel it. A strange, inexplicable connection to this man, this creature, this werewolf. A connection that defied logic and reason, a connection that terrified her and yet, at the same time, drew her in like a moth to a flame. A small, desperate cry escaped, muffled by the rain. Would this unwanted connection be a bond or a cage? Chapter 3. Echoes in the Abandoned Shrine. The question hung in the air, a fragile butterfly pinned between them. Would this unwanted connection be a bond or a cage? Kasha stared at Rhys, the rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead, highlighting the sharp angles of his face. The golden fire in his eyes had dimmed slightly, replaced by a watchful intensity that sent a fresh wave of unease through her. She couldn't answer him, not with words. Her throat was tight, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, yes, but also a strange sense of recognition. It was as if a part of her, a part she hadn't known existed, was stirring, responding to his presence, to the ancient energy that seemed to emanate from him. I don't understand any of this, she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. Werewolves' bonds, it's impossible. Rhys gave a slow, sad smile, a fleeting expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. Impossible is a word humans use when they don't understand the world around them, he said. There are things, Kasha, that exist beyond the realm of your science, your logic. Things that have existed for centuries, hidden in the shadows, whispered in legends. He gestured towards the abandoned shrine, the carved wolf above the entrance gleaming wetly in the dim light. This place, it's a nexus. A point where the veil between worlds is thin. A place where the past and the present collide. Kasha followed his gaze, her eyes tracing the outline of the wolf. She remembered the strange dreams she'd had, the recurring image of running through a forest, the feeling of being pursued. She remembered the silver locket her mother had given her, the one she always wore, the one that felt strangely warm now against her skin. My mother, she knew, didn't she? Kasha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She knew about all of this. Rhys nodded.
She did.
Alara was a remarkable woman. Strong, resilient, and deeply protective of you. She understood the dangers, the complexities of our world. She tried to shield you from it, to give you a normal life. The mention of her mother's name, Alara, brought a fresh wave of grief, mingled with a growing sense of betrayal. Why hadn't her mother told her the truth? Why had she kept her in the dark, leaving her to grapple with this destiny alone?
But why?
Kasha asked, her voice rising in frustration.
Why didn't she tell me?
Why did she let me believe it was all just superstition? Rhys looked away, his gaze fixed on the rain-soaked forest. She was afraid, he said, his voice low. Afraid of what it would mean for you. Afraid of the hunt. Afraid of me. The last word was barely a whisper, but it struck Kasha with the force of a physical blow. He was afraid of himself? Of what he was? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but it also sparked a flicker of empathy. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weariness that seemed to weigh him down, the burden of a legacy he hadn't chosen. What is the hunt? Kasha asked, her voice softer now, her curiosity overcoming her fear, at least for the moment. Rhys turned back to her, his golden eyes holding hers.
It's a calling, he said.
A primal instinct that drives us. A need to find our mate. Our soulmate. The word soulmate resonated deep within Kasha, stirring something ancient and powerful within her. She had always dismissed the concept as romantic fantasy, the stuff of fairy tales. But looking at Rhys, feeling the strange pull between them, she couldn't deny that something extraordinary was happening. And you believe I'm your soulmate? She asked, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer immediately. He simply reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. His hand was warm and strong, his fingers calloused, yet his touch was surprisingly gentle. The hunt doesn't believe, he said, his voice a low rumble. It knows. And it has led me to you, Kasha Wren. After all these years, it has finally led me to you. His words sent a wave of dizziness through her. She felt overwhelmed, lost, caught in a current she couldn't control. She wanted to pull her hand away, to run, to escape, but she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, held captive by his gaze, by the warmth of his touch, by the undeniable pull between them. He raised her hand to his lips, his breath warm against her skin. He pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that was both tender and possessive. The touch sent a shiver through her, a mixture of fear and something else. Something she couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't name. But what will happen now? Her quiet question was a surrender, and the beginnings of a terrifying new reality. Chapter 4. The Hunt's Claim. The question, but what will happen now, hung heavy in the air, a fragile bridge between Kasha's former life and the terrifying, unknown future that Rhys represented. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the forest shrouded in a misty silence that amplified the pounding of her heart. His kiss, that brief, electric touch on her knuckles, lingered, a brand on her skin. Rhys lowered her hand but didn't release it. His golden eyes, now softer, searched hers, a flicker of something akin to vulnerability within their depths. That, he said, his voice a low rumble, depend on you. The weight of that statement settled upon Kasha like the damp forest air. On her? How could this possibly depend on her? She was an ordinary woman, a librarian by trade, a woman who had spent her life avoiding conflict, avoiding anything that hinted at the extraordinary. She was not equipped for this, for werewolves, for ancient bonds, for a hunt that had apparently chosen her. I don't understand, she stammered, her voice trembling. What choice do I have? He tightened his grip slightly on her hand, a reassuring gesture, not a controlling one. You have the choice to accept this connection, he said, or to reject it, to walk away and try to return to the life you knew. The thought of walking away, of returning to her quiet, predictable existence, was tempting. To go back to her books, her routines, her solitary life, where the only mysteries were the ones contained within the pages of a novel. But even as the thought formed, she knew it was a lie. She couldn't unsee what she had seen, unfeel what she had felt. Reese Blackwood had shattered her reality, and there was no going back. And if I reject it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The light in his eyes dimmed, a shadow of pain crossing his features. The hunt will continue, he said, his voice laced with a weariness that spoke of centuries of longing. It will torment you. It will draw you back, time and time again. Until you either accept it, or he didn't finish the sentence, but Kasha understood. Until she either accepted it, or was driven mad by the constant pull, the relentless pursuit. Or worse, the unspoken threat hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the power of this ancient force. And if I accept it? She asked, her voice stronger now, a flicker of defiance sparking within her. His eyes brightened, a spark of hope rekindling in their golden depths. Then we begin, he said. We explore this bond. We learn what it means. We face the challenges together. Challenges? Kasha echoed, her heart sinking. She had a feeling those challenges were not going to be simple. He nodded. Our world is not easy, he said. There are dangers, prejudices, ancient enmities. There are those who would oppose our union. He paused, his gaze shifting to the forest around them, as if listening for something, watching for something. Kasha followed his gaze, her senses on high alert. She could hear the rustling of leaves, the dripping of water, the distant call of a bird. But there was something else, too, a subtle shift in the air, a feeling of being watched. Who? She asked, her voice a low whisper. Who would oppose us? Reese turned back to her, his expression grave. Those who fear the power of the hunt, he said. Those who cling to old hatreds. Those who hunt us. The word hunt took on a new, more sinister meaning. Not the mystical, primal force that had brought them together, but a literal hunt, a pursuit by those who sought to destroy them. The thought sent a chill down her spine, a stark reminder of the danger she was stepping into.
But why?
Kasha asked, her voice trembling. Why would they hunt us? Because we are different, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. Because we represent a power they don't understand, a power they fear. Because some believe the Blackwood line is cursed. The word cursed echoed the local legends, the whispered tales of tragedy and darkness that had surrounded the Blackwood family for generations. Kasha remembered the stories, the rumors of madness, of violence, of a family consumed by their own nature. She looked at Reese, at the sadness in his eyes, the weight of his past, the burden of his legacy. She saw not a monster, but a man, a creature, trapped by fate, by a destiny he hadn't chosen. And despite her fear, despite the overwhelming uncertainty of the future, she felt a growing sense of compassion. And, impossibly, a fragile thread of connection that was starting to feel undeniably real. It was the smallest spark of empathy, the faintest glimmer of hope in the darkness. What choice would she make when she still had to decide on just what choice she could make? Chapter 5. A glimpse of golden eyes. The spark of empathy, the glimmer of hope, they were fragile things, easily extinguished by the chilling reality of Reese's words. Cursed. The word resonated with the damp, heavy air of the forest, a tangible manifestation of the fear that still clawed at Kasha. Yet, she couldn't tear her gaze away from his. Those golden eyes, windows to a soul both ancient and tormented, held her captive. Cursed? She repeated, her voice a breathy whisper that the wind almost snatched away. What does that mean? Reese released her hand, a subtle shift that left her feeling strangely bereft. He turned slightly, his profile sharp against the backdrop of the dripping trees, and for a moment, he seemed to be lost in thought, wrestling with some internal demon. The Blackwood curse, he began, his voice low and rough, is a tale as old as Silver Creek itself. It speaks of an ancestor, Alaric Blackwood, who made a dark pact to gain power, to protect his family. But the price was steep. It twisted the bloodline, binding us to the moon, to the beast within. He paused, his jaw clenching, his hands fisting at his sides. Kasha could see the struggle, the internal battle raging within him. It was a battle between the man he seemed to be and the creature he was forced to become. The legend says, he continued, his voice strained, that the Blackwoods are prone to madness, to uncontrolled rage, to a hunger that can never be satisfied, that we are destined to bring ruin upon ourselves and those we love. Kasha shivered, remembering the stories she'd heard as a child, the whispers of the Blackwood family's descent into darkness. She had dismissed them as folklore, as the exaggerated tales of a superstitious town. But now, standing before Reese, hearing the pain in his voice, seeing the shadows in his eyes, she knew they held a kernel of truth. "But you're not mad," she said, the words hesitant, almost a question. He turned back to her, a flicker of something that might have been amusement crossing his features. "Not yet," he said, a hint of self-deprecating humor in his tone. "But the potential is always there, Kasha, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the trigger. The trigger. The full moon." Her mother's warnings came flooding back, the frantic pleas to stay away from the windows, to lock the doors, to ignore the howling wind. Kasha had always thought her mother was simply unwell. Now she understood. Her mother had been protecting her, shielding her from the truth, from the reality of the Blackwood curse. "And the hunt," Kasha said, her voice trembling. "Is that part of the curse?" Reese nodded slowly. "It is. The hunt is the manifestation of the curse. It's the primal drive to find our mate, to complete the bond, to perpetuate the bloodline. But it's also a torment, a constant longing, a relentless pursuit that can consume us if we resist it." He looked at her then, his golden eyes intense, searching hers. "And you, Kasha Wren," he said, his voice a low murmur, "are the object of my hunt, the one the curse has led me to, the one who holds the key to my fate." The weight of his words settled upon her, a crushing burden of responsibility. She was the key? To his fate? To the fate of the Blackwood line? It was too much, too overwhelming. She felt a surge of panic, a desperate urge to flee, to escape this destiny that was being thrust upon her.
But then she saw it.
A flicker of something in his eyes, a glimpse of something beyond the curse, beyond the hunt, beyond the darkness. A flicker of vulnerability, of loneliness, of hope. It was a fleeting glimpse, quickly masked by the shadows, but it was enough. It was enough to stay her flight, to quiet the screaming voice of fear within her. It was enough to make her realize that this wasn't just about a curse, or a bond, or a hunt. It was about two souls, connected by fate, grappling with a legacy they hadn't chosen. She took a deep breath, the damp air filling her lungs, grounding her. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something she couldn't quite define, something that felt strangely like acceptance. "Tell me more," she said, and the simple question echoed in the silence as the sky began to yield to the softest hints of twilight. What more was there to a cursed man and an unwilling woman, bound together by forces neither fully understood? Chapter 6. The Curse of Silver Creek. "Tell me more." Kasha's request hung in the twilight air, a fragile thread of connection between them. Reese searched her face, the golden light in his eyes flickering with a mixture of surprise and relief. He hadn't expected acceptance. Not so quickly, not so easily. He had expected fear, rejection, the same reactions he'd encountered for centuries. He gestured towards a fallen log, moss-covered and damp from the rain. "Let's sit," he said, his voice still low, but with a subtle easing of tension. "This is a long story." Kasha hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her movements cautious, as if she were approaching a wild animal. She sat on the log, keeping a careful distance between them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Reese sat beside her, but he, too, maintained a respectful space, understanding her need for reassurance. The forest was growing darker, the twilight deepening, casting long shadows that danced and shifted around them. The air was filled with the sound of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. It was a familiar soundscape, yet tonight, it felt different, charged with a new, unsettling awareness. The curse, Rhys began, his gaze fixed on the darkening woods, began with Alaric Blackwood, my ancestor, in the late 17th century. He was a powerful man, a landowner, a leader in the newly formed community of Silver Creek. But he was also ambitious. He craved more power, more control, more security for his family. He paused, his jaw clenching, his hands fisting in his lap. Kasha could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of his family's history pressing down on him. He sought out ancient knowledge. Rhys continued, his voice strained. Forbidden knowledge. He delved into rituals, practices that were outlawed. He made a pact with a force, a primal entity that dwelled in these woods. A spirit of the wild, of the moon, of the wolf. Kasha shivered, remembering the carved wolf above the shrine entrance, the symbol she'd seen in her mother's journals. It was a symbol of power, yes, but also of danger. The pact granted Alaric and his descendants enhanced abilities, Rhys said. Strength, speed, heightened senses, the ability to shift, to take the form of a wolf. It made them powerful protectors, feared and respected throughout the region. But at a cost, Kasha whispered, finishing his sentence. Rhys nodded, his gaze meeting hers. At a terrible cost, he confirmed. The pact twisted the bloodline, binding us to the lunar cycle, to the animalistic instincts. It amplified our emotions, our desires. It made us volatile, prone to rage. He looked away, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The full moon became our curse. A time of heightened power, yes, but also of uncontrolled transformation, of madness, of bloodlust. Kasha remembered her mother's warnings, the frantic locking of doors, the drawn curtains, the whispered pleas to stay silent. She understood now the fear that had driven her mother, the fear that had haunted their lives. The legend says, Rhys continued, his voice laced with bitterness, that Alaric's descendants were doomed to repeat his mistakes, to be consumed by the darkness, to bring ruin upon themselves and those they loved. That we are monsters, destined to hurt those we are meant to protect. He said this last part with a devastating sadness. He turned to her then, his golden eyes searching hers, a plea for understanding in their depths. But it's not inevitable, Kasha, he said, his voice regaining some of its strength. We can fight it. We can control it. We can choose a different path. His words offered a glimmer of hope, a fragile counterpoint to the darkness of the curse. But Kasha couldn't ignore the fear that still gnawed at her, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the beast within him, and the equally potent fear of the beast within herself that she was only now beginning to suspect. How? She asked, her voice trembling. How can you control it? He reached out and took her hand again, his touch gentle, reassuring. His warmth, the solid reality of his presence, calmed the frantic beating of her heart. Together, he said, his voice a low murmur. With the bond, with love, the forest sounds and the truth of the curse seemed to hold their breath in the aftermath of his quiet declaration. Was love, or this bond, enough to truly overcome a centuries-old curse? Chapter 7. Unspoken bonds, unseen chains. Together, with the bond, with love. The words hung in the air, fragile and yet potent, a lifeline offered in the encroaching darkness. Kasha stared at Rhys, his hand warm and strong around hers, his golden eyes searching her face. Love? Could love truly conquer a curse, a centuries-old legacy of darkness and violence? It sounded like the stuff of fairy tales, the kind of naive hope she'd long ago abandoned. Yet, looking at him, feeling the undeniable pull between them, the strange sense of recognition, of belonging, she couldn't dismiss it entirely. There was something there, something beyond the fear, beyond the curse, beyond the logical, rational world she'd always inhabited. Something that whispered of a connection deeper than anything she'd ever known. Love, she echoed, the word feeling foreign and yet strangely familiar on her tongue. I don't know if I believe in that. Not anymore. Her past relationships had been fleeting, marked by a restlessness, a sense of incompleteness, a feeling that she was always searching for something she couldn't name. She had loved, yes, but it had always been a fragile, tentative love, easily broken by the realities of life, by her own inability to truly connect. Reese's gaze didn't waver, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that surprised her. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You've been hurt. You've built walls around your heart. You've learned to protect yourself." He knew? How could he possibly know? He'd only just met her, and yet, he seemed to see straight through her defenses, to the core of her being, to the loneliness and the yearning she'd tried so hard to bury. "But this is different, Kasha," he continued, his voice laced with a conviction that was both unsettling and compelling. "This isn't just human love. It's a soul bond, a connection that transcends time and space, that binds us together on a level you can't yet comprehend." The term soul bond sent a shiver down her spine. It sounded mystical, fantastical. Yet, the way he said it, the intensity of his gaze, the strange energy that crackled between them, it all pointed to something beyond the ordinary, something that defied explanation. What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A soul bond?" He tightened his grip slightly on her hand, a reassuring gesture. "It means we are connected," he said. "On a spiritual level. Our souls recognize each other. They complete each other. It's a bond that is unbreakable. Forged by the hunt, by the essence of a wolf. Unbreakable." The word sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She had always valued her independence, her freedom. The thought of being inextricably linked to another being, to a werewolf, for eternity, it was terrifying. "But what if I don't want it?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "What if I reject this bond?" The light in his eyes dimmed, a shadow of pain crossing his features. He released her hand, the loss of his warmth leaving her feeling strangely cold. "You can try," he said, his voice laced with a weariness that spoke of centuries of longing and loss. "You can fight it. You can run. But the bond, it will always be there, pulling you back, tormenting you, until you either accept it, or..." He didn't finish the sentence, but she knew. Until she either accepted it, or was consumed by it. The choice, it seemed, was not a choice at all. "And what does accepting it entail?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on her hands, now clasped tightly in her lap. He reached out and gently cupped her chin, lifting her face so that she was forced to meet his gaze. His touch was surprisingly tender, sending a jolt of warmth through her, a warmth that momentarily eased the chilling fear. "It means embracing your true nature," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Accepting the wolf within you." The wolf within her? The concept was absurd, terrifying. She was a librarian, a woman of books and quiet contemplation. She was not a wild creature, a creature of instinct and bloodlust. I don't have a wolf within me," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not like you." A faint smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You are more like me than you know, Kasha Wren," he said. "The blood of Alaric Blackwood flows in your veins, too. The legacy is yours as well. It's just dormant, waiting to be awakened." He moved his fingers, softly tracing the silver chain. He was so close, how could she reconcile the reality of his words with the tenderness in his eyes? Chapter 8. Shadows of a Forgotten Past. His fingers traced the delicate chain of her silver locket, the metal cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of his touch. Kasha's breath hitched. The locket. Her mother's locket. The one she'd always worn, the one containing the faded photograph of the father she'd never known. A father her mother had refused to speak of.
"Dormant," he'd said.
"Waiting to be awakened." The words echoed in her mind, a chilling premonition of the changes to come, changes she wasn't sure she was ready for. "My father," she began, her voice hesitant, her gaze fixed on the locket. "What would you know about him?" Reese's hand stilled, his fingers lingering on the silver. His golden eyes darkened, a shadow of pain crossing his features. He looked away, his gaze shifting to the deepening twilight of the forest. He was a Blackwood, he said, his voice low and rough, laced with a complex mixture of emotions, regret, grief, and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. Kasha's heart pounded in her chest. A Blackwood? Her father? It was impossible. Yet, deep down, a part of her had always suspected it, had always sensed a hidden connection to this place, to this family, to this curse. But my mother, she never said, Kasha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She never told me. She was protecting you, Reese said, his voice gentle, understanding. She knew the dangers. She wanted you to have a normal life, a life free from the burden of our legacy. But why him? Kasha asked, her voice rising in frustration. Why did she fall in love with the Blackwood? Reese turned back to her, his gaze intense, searching hers. The hunt, he said, his voice a low murmur. It's a powerful force, Kasha. It draws us together, despite the risks, despite the consequences. It's undeniable, inescapable. He paused, his gaze softening. Your mother, Alara, she was strong, fiercely independent. She resisted the pull for a long time, but she couldn't fight it forever. She fell in love with Liam. Your father. Liam. Her father's name. It felt strange, foreign, and yet familiar. A missing piece of the puzzle that was her life, finally falling into place. What would happen to him? She asked, her voice trembling, dreading the answer. Reese's expression darkened, his jaw clenching. He died, he said, his voice strained. Before you were born. He was killed.
Killed.
The word struck her like a physical blow. Her father, a man she'd never known, a man who was a Blackwood, a werewolf, a victim of the curse, dead.
Murdered. How?
She whispered, her voice barely audible. How did he die? Reese hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers.
It's a complicated story, he said.
A story filled with tragedy and betrayal. A story that involves my family. My father. His father? The implication was clear. Reese's father had been involved in Liam's death. The thought sent a fresh wave of shock and anger through her. How could she possibly be connected to a man whose family had killed her father? Your father, she began, her voice shaking, her hands fisting in her lap. He killed my father? Reese looked at her then, his golden eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. Not intentionally, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was an accident, a consequence of the curse, of the uncontrolled transformation, of the madness. An accident? Madness? The words offered little comfort. Her father was still dead, and Reese's family was responsible. The bond, the connection, the love he spoke of, how could it possibly overcome such a devastating truth? I don't understand, she said, her voice breaking. How can you expect me to accept this? To forgive? He reached out and took her hand again, his touch gentle, despite the turmoil raging within both of them. His warmth, the solid reality of his presence, was the only anchor in a sea of confusion and pain. I don't expect forgiveness, Kasha, he said, his voice a low murmur. Not yet. But I hope you can understand. That you can see that I am not my father. That I am trying to break the cycle. To forge a different path. He was so close, the earnest and shadowed sorrow on his face, starting to break the wall of fear, piece by piece. Where would forging a different path even begin? Chapter 9. The Moon's Silent Call. Forge a different path. The words echoed in the growing darkness, a promise whispered against the backdrop of a tragic past. Kasha looked at Reese, his hand still holding hers, his golden eyes pleading for understanding. Could he truly break free from the curse that had haunted his family for centuries? Could they forge a different path together? The question swirled within her, unanswered, unsettling. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the weight of the past, the knowledge of her father's death, the shadow of the Blackwood curse, it all loomed large, a seemingly insurmountable barrier between them. It's getting late, she said, her voice trembling slightly, pulling her hand away from his. A subtle shift, a small act of self-preservation. I should go. Reese nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He understood her need for space, for time to process the overwhelming revelations of the evening. He didn't try to stop her, didn't try to pressure her. He simply respected her decision. "I'll walk you back," he said, his voice low. They rose from the fallen log, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. The forest had grown completely dark now, the only light filtering through the dense canopy from the rising moon. A full moon. Kasha's breath hitched. The full moon. Her mother's warnings came flooding back, the frantic pleas to stay away from the windows, to lock the doors, to ignore the howling. She glanced at Reese, her heart pounding in her chest. He seemed different. Taller, perhaps. More imposing. His muscles were tense, his jaw clenched, his golden eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. He was on edge. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at the moon, his gaze fixed, his body trembling slightly. Kasha could feel the change in him, the rising power, the animalistic instinct taking hold. It was terrifying, and yet, at the same time, strangely fascinating. "The moon," he said, his voice strained, his breath coming in ragged gasps.
"It calls to me. To us."
The us sent a shiver down her spine. Was she feeling it too? The pull of the moon? The stirring of something wild within her? She looked at the moon, its silvery light bathing the forest in an ethereal glow. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and frightening. She felt a strange sensation, a tingling in her veins, a heightened awareness of her surroundings. The scent of the forest, the rustling of the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, it all seemed amplified, intensified. She felt alive, more alive than she'd ever felt before. But there was also fear, a primal fear of the unknown, of the changes happening within her, of the power she sensed lurking beneath the surface. I don't like this," she whispered, her voice trembling. Reese turned to her then, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity that both terrified and captivated her. He reached out and took her hand again, his touch surprisingly gentle, despite the raw power that emanated from him. "Don't be afraid, Kasha," he said, his voice a low rumble, a soothing counterpoint to the wildness of the moon. "I won't let anything happen to you. I'll control it."
He was fighting it, she realized.
Fighting the transformation, fighting the beast within, fighting for her. The realization sent a wave of gratitude through her, a fragile counterpoint to the fear. They began to walk, their pace slow, deliberate. Reese kept a close watch on her, his senses on high alert, his body a shield between her and the darkness. He guided her through the trees, his hand firmly clasped in hers, his presence a reassuring anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. As they walked, Kasha began to notice the subtle changes in him. The way his muscles rippled beneath his shirt, the way his senses seemed to extend beyond the normal range, the way his golden eyes glowed with an almost supernatural light. He was transforming, slowly, subtly, but undeniably. She should have been terrified. She was terrified. But there was also something else. A strange sense of wonder.
Of awe.
She was witnessing something extraordinary, something that defied logic and reason, something that belonged to the realm of myth and legend. And, impossibly, she felt a growing sense of connection. To Reese, to the moon, to the wildness that was stirring within her. It was a fragile connection, easily broken, but it was there. A spark of hope in the darkness. It all felt like walking towards an unknown horizon and the promise of a new, terrifying world. Chapter 10. Scars that Whisper Truth. The walk back to the cottage was a blur of heightened senses and suppressed fear. Kasha felt Reese's control fraying with every step, the moon's pull a tangible force tugging at him, at the beast barely held in check. She clung to his hand, her own fear battling with a strange, burgeoning sense of understanding. She could feel his struggle, the internal war raging within him. They reached the edge of the Blackwood estate, the rusted iron gates looming before them, a stark reminder of the boundary between two worlds. Kasha's mother's cottage was just beyond, a beacon of normalcy in the encroaching darkness. Reese stopped, his body rigid, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wouldn't cross the gates. Not tonight. Not under the full moon. You'll be safe here, he said, his voice strained, his golden eyes flickering with an almost desperate intensity.
Go.
Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone. His words were a command, but also a plea. He was protecting her, even from himself. Kasha nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She wanted to stay, to help him, to understand, but she knew she couldn't. She wasn't ready.
Not yet.
She turned and ran, her feet pounding on the familiar path, her heart hammering in her chest. She reached the cottage, fumbled with the key, and stumbled inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling. She was safe.
For now.
But the image of Reese, standing at the gates, his body taut, his eyes blazing with the moon's wild light, was seared into her mind. She drew the curtains, shutting out the moonlight, trying to shut out the reality of what she had learned. But it was no use. The knowledge was there, a seed planted in her mind, a seed that was already beginning to sprout. She wandered through the small, familiar rooms of the cottage, her mother's presence a tangible force in every corner. The scent of lavender and old books, the faded floral wallpaper, the worn armchair by the fireplace, it all spoke of a life she had once known, a life that now seemed impossibly distant. She stopped in front of the small, antique mirror hanging in the hallway. She looked at her reflection, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear and something else. Something she couldn't quite define. She reached up and touched her cheek, the place where Reese's fingertips had brushed her skin. She could still feel the lingering warmth, the electric jolt of his touch. She remembered the look in his eyes, the vulnerability, the hope. She lowered her hand and touched the silver locket, the one she always wore, the one containing the photograph of her father. Liam, a Blackwood, a werewolf, her father. She opened the locket, her fingers trembling. She stared at the faded photograph, the image of a man she'd never known, a man with dark hair and golden eyes. Reese's eyes. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She saw the resemblance, the undeniable connection. She saw the legacy that had been passed down to her, the legacy she could no longer deny. She closed the locket, her hand shaking. She felt a strange mixture of grief and acceptance. Grief for the father she'd never known, acceptance of the truth, of the reality of who she was. She walked over to the fireplace, where a small, dusty box sat on the mantelpiece. It was her mother's box, filled with old letters, photographs, and journals. She had avoided opening it since returning to Silver Creek, afraid of what she might find, afraid of the past. But tonight, she needed answers. She needed to understand. She sat down in the worn armchair, pulled the box onto her lap, and opened it. The scent of old paper and dried flowers wafted up, a poignant reminder of her mother. She began to sift through the contents, her heart heavy with a mixture of sadness and anticipation. She found old letters, yellowed with age, written in her mother's elegant script. Letters to friends, to family, to Liam. Letters filled with love, with longing, with fear. She found photographs, faded and blurred, of her mother, of Liam, of a young Reese. A Reese who looked different. Softer, perhaps. Less burdened. Before the curse had fully taken hold. And then she found the journals. Small, leather-bound books filled with her mother's frantic handwriting. She began to read, her eyes scanning the pages, her heart pounding in her chest. The journals told a story of love, of betrayal, of sacrifice. A story of a woman caught between two worlds, a woman who had tried to protect her daughter from a destiny she couldn't escape. As she read, Kasha began to understand. She understood her mother's fear, her protectiveness, her silence. She understood the burden Alara had carried, the sacrifices she had made. She also understood the truth about Liam's death. It hadn't been a simple accident, as Reese had claimed. It had been more complicated. more tragic. There were names, dates, veiled references to a struggle within the Blackwood family, a struggle for power, a struggle for control. A struggle that had cost Liam his life. The journal ended abruptly, the last entry dated just weeks before Kash's birth. The final words, scrawled in a shaky hand, were a plea: protect her.
Keep her safe.
From the hunt. From the Blackwoods. From herself. Kasha closed the journal, her hands trembling. The scars of the past, she realized, ran deeper than she'd ever imagined. And they whispered a truth that was far more complex and far more dangerous than Rhys had revealed. She needed to know what he was keeping from her. Chapter 11. A Pact Made in Moonlight. The journal lay heavy in Kasha's lap, a testament to a past filled with secrets and betrayals. The truth about Liam's death, hinted at in her mother's frantic scrawls, was a gaping wound, a chasm between her and Rhys. She needed answers. She needed to confront him. But not tonight. Not under the full moon, when his control was fragile, when the beast within him held sway. She would wait. She would gather her strength, steel her resolve, and face him in the light of day. She spent the rest of the night restless, unable to sleep, her mind replaying the events of the evening, the revelations of the journal. The image of Rhys, standing at the gates, his body taut, his eyes blazing with the moon's wild light, was a constant presence, a reminder of the danger, but also of the connection. As dawn approached, a pale, watery light filtering through the drawn curtains, Kasha rose from the armchair, her body stiff and aching. She felt different.
Changed.
The full moon had left its mark, stirring something within her, something she couldn't quite define, but something that felt powerful. She walked over to the mirror, her gaze drawn to her reflection. Her eyes seemed brighter, her skin more vibrant. She felt a heightened awareness of her surroundings, a sense of alertness. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The wolf within her, awakening. She dressed quickly, choosing practical clothes, jeans, a sturdy sweater, her walking boots. She needed to be prepared for whatever the day might bring. She left the cottage, locking the door behind her, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The forest was alive with the sounds of birdsong, the rustling of leaves, the gentle breeze. It was a beautiful day, the sky clear, bright blue, the sun warm on her face. But Kasha couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense of impending confrontation. She walked towards the Blackwood estate, her pace deliberate, her senses on high alert. She reached the rusted iron gates, the boundary between her world and Rhys's. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the cold metal, then pushed them open and stepped through. The path beyond the gates was overgrown, winding through the dense forest. Kasha followed it, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had to know the truth. The whole truth. About her father, about Rhys's family, about the curse. She reached the clearing where the abandoned shrine stood, the stone walls bathed in the morning sunlight. Rhys was there, waiting for her. He was leaning against one of the walls, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the forest. He looked different. The wildness of the previous night had receded, replaced by a quiet intensity. He was still breathtaking, but in a different way. More human. Less feral. He sensed her presence and turned, his golden eyes meeting hers. He didn't speak, didn't move. He simply waited, his expression unreadable. Kasha took a deep breath, steeling her resolve. "I read my mother's journal," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. His expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, guilt, resignation, crossed his features. "I know about my father," she continued, "about how he died. I know it wasn't an accident." Rhys lowered his gaze, his jaw clenching. "It was complicated," he said, his voice low. "Complicated?" Kasha echoed, her voice rising in anger. "He was murdered, Rhys. And your family, your father was involved." He looked up at her then, his golden eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "My father, he was a broken man," he said, his voice strained. "Consumed by the curse, by the madness. He lost control." "Lost control?" Kasha repeated, her voice shaking. That's your excuse? He killed the man my mother loved. He killed my father. I know, Reese said, his voice a low rumble. And I am sorry. For what my father did. For what my family has done. For the pain we have caused you. His apology, his genuine remorse, softened her anger, but it didn't erase the pain. It didn't change the truth. There's more, isn't there? She asked, her voice quieter now, her gaze searching his. Something you're not telling me. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. The journal had hinted at something, he said. A struggle within the family.
A pact.
Kasha's heart skipped a beat.
The pact.
The one Alaric Blackwood had made. The one that had started the curse. Her mother's journal had mentioned it, but only in veiled references, in fragmented sentences. What pact? She asked, her voice trembling. Reese took a deep breath, his gaze meeting hers again. A pact made in moonlight, he said, his voice a low murmur. A pact to ensure the survival of the Blackwood line. A pact that bound us to the hunt, to the full moon, to each other. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle, but firm. A pact, he added very quietly, that requires a sacrifice. The word hung like a death knell between them, and the forest seemed to go unnaturally silent. Chapter 12. The Price of Forbidden Longing. A pact that requires a sacrifice. The words echoed in the silent clearing, a chilling revelation that sent a wave of dread through Kasha. Sacrifice? What's sacrifice? Her mind reeled, grasping for understanding, for a way to make sense of this nightmare. Reese's hand tightened around hers, his touch a grounding force in the swirling chaos of her emotions. His golden eyes, filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination, searched her face. What kind of sacrifice? She asked, her voice trembling, her throat tight with fear. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers, as if he couldn't bear to see her reaction. The pact it demands a union, he said, his voice low and strained. A joining of two souls. A bonding that will strengthen the Blackwood line, ensure its survival. A union? A bonding? The words sounded romantic, almost. But the context, the chilling undertones, the shadow of the curse, it all pointed to something far more sinister. You mean marriage? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her mind struggling to grasp the implications. He shook his head slowly.
More than marriage, he said.
A deeper connection. A merging of souls. A blood bond. Blood bond. The term sent a shiver down her spine. It sounded barbaric. Ancient. Terrifying. And who is to be sacrificed? She asked, her voice trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She already knew the answer. She could feel it in her bones, but she needed to hear him say it. He looked at her then, his golden eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. You, Kasha, he said, his voice a low murmur.
And me.
She stared at him, her mind reeling. She was to be sacrificed? Along with Reese? To a blood bond? To a curse? It was insane.
Impossible.
No, she whispered, shaking her head, pulling her hand away from his. I won't do it. I won't be a sacrifice. He didn't try to stop her, didn't try to force her. He simply watched her, his expression resigned, as if he had expected her rejection. The hunt, it won't let you go, Kasha, he said, his voice laced with a weariness that spoke of centuries of struggle. It will pursue you.
Until you submit.
Until the pact is fulfilled. There has to be another way, she said, her voice rising in desperation. There has to be a way to break the curse. To avoid the sacrifice. He shook his head slowly. The pact is ancient. Powerful. It cannot be broken. Only fulfilled. But why me? She asked, her voice breaking. Why did the hunt choose me? He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her, a warmth that momentarily eased the chilling fear. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a tender gesture that belied the darkness of their situation. Because you are strong, Kasha, he said, his voice a low murmur. Resilient. You have the strength to endure the bond. to control the power, to perhaps even heal the curse. Heal the curse? The thought was ludicrous. And yet, a flicker of hope sparked within her, a fragile counterpoint to the overwhelming despair.
Could she?
Could she somehow use this bond, this sacrifice, to break the cycle of violence and darkness that had haunted the Blackwood family for centuries? I don't know, she said, her voice trembling, her gaze fixed on his. I need time.
To think.
To understand. He nodded slowly, his expression understanding. I know, he said, and I will give you all the time you need. But be warned, Kasia. The hunt grows stronger with each passing day. And the full moon it will return. The full moon. The trigger. The time of uncontrolled transformation, of madness. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her, a stark reminder of the danger she was facing, the danger they were facing. Their gazes locked, a silent understanding passing between them. They were bound together, by fate, by the hunt, by the curse. And the price of that bond, the price of their forbidden longing, was a sacrifice neither of them was sure they were willing to make. It all ended, once again, with a terrifying uncertainty. Chapter 13. Echoes of a Lost Love. The weight of Rhys's words, the full moon will return, settled upon Kasia like a shroud.
Time.
She needed time, but time was a luxury she might not have. The hunt, the curse, the impending full moon, they were all closing in, a tightening circle of fate from which there seemed no escape. She left the clearing, walking back towards the cottage, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, yes, but also a growing sense of determination. She wouldn't be a passive victim. She wouldn't simply submit to the sacrifice. She would fight. She would find a way to understand, to control, perhaps even break the curse. She reached the cottage, the familiar surroundings a small comfort in the encroaching darkness. She locked the door behind her, but the security felt fragile. The walls of the cottage couldn't protect her from the hunt, from the bond, from the wolf within her. She wandered through the rooms, her gaze drawn to the objects that spoke of her mother, of her past. The scent of lavender and old books, the faded floral wallpaper, the worn armchair by the fireplace, they all seemed to whisper secrets, to offer clues, to guide her. She sat down in the armchair, her mother's journal still lying on the small table beside it. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover. She needed to understand the pact, the sacrifice, the curse. She needed to find a way to fight it. She opened the journal, flipping through the pages, her eyes scanning the frantic handwriting. She reread the passages about Liam, about his death, about the struggle within the Blackwood family. She searched for clues, for answers, for hope. And then she found it, a small, folded piece of paper, tucked between the pages of the journal. It was a letter, yellowed with age, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Not her mother's, not Liam's, but familiar, somehow. She unfolded the letter carefully, her hands trembling. She began to read, her eyes widening with each word. The letter was from Alaric Blackwood, the ancestor who had made the pact, the one who had started the curse. It was addressed to his son, Rhys's great-great-grandfather. It was a confession, a warning, a plea. Alaric wrote of his regret, of his despair. He wrote of the darkness that had consumed him, of the price he had paid for power. He wrote of the sacrifice, the blood bond, that was required to maintain the pact. But he also wrote of something else. Something unexpected. A loophole. A way to mitigate the curse. A way to control the power. A way to perhaps even break the bond. The key, Alaric wrote, lay in the love between the two souls bound by the pact. A true love, a selfless love, a love that was stronger than the curse itself. A love that could transform the darkness into light. A love that could heal. Kasia's heart pounded in her chest. Love? Could love truly be the key? It sounded fantastical, impossible. And yet, the words of Alaric Blackwood, written centuries ago, resonated with a truth that she couldn't deny. She remembered Rhys's words, together. With the bond. With love. He had known. He had always known. He had believed in the possibility of healing, of redemption. But the letter also contained a warning. Alaric wrote that the love must be pure, untainted by fear, by doubt, by betrayal. Any weakness, any faltering, would strengthen the curse, would doom the bonded souls. Kasia closed the letter, her hands trembling. She felt a surge of hope, but also of fear. Could she love Rhys? Truly, deeply, selflessly? Could she overcome her fear, her doubts, her anger over her father's death? She looked at the silver locket, still hanging around her neck. She opened it, her gaze fixed on the faded photograph of Liam, her father, a Blackwood, a victim of the curse. She felt a wave of grief, of longing. She wished she had known him, had had the chance to love him. And then she realized. She did love him. She loved him, not as a daughter loves a father, but as a soul recognizes a kindred spirit. She loved him, not for who he was, but for who he represented.
Hope. Strength.
Resilience. And she realized something else. She was starting to love Rhys. Not in the way she had loved other men, with a tentative, fragile affection, but with a deeper, more profound connection. A connection that transcended the curse, the bond, the fear. It was a fragile love, still nascent, still uncertain. But it was there. A spark of light in the darkness. A possibility of healing. A chance to break free. She looked up, away from the locket and letter, and out of the window. The sun was setting, the sky a blaze of crimson and gold, but the beauty did nothing to settle the tremor of terror. How could she be certain of anything? Chapter 14. The Hunter's Heart Unveiled. The sunset bled across the sky, painting the forest in hues of fire and shadow, a visual echo of the turmoil within Kasia. The letter from Alaric Blackwood, the glimmer of hope it offered, the terrifying condition it demanded, it all swirled within her, a vortex of uncertainty. Could she truly love Rhys? Could he truly love her? Enough to break a centuries-old curse? She needed to see him.
To talk to him.
To understand. She left the cottage, the letter clutched in her hand, and walked towards the Blackwood estate. The air was cool, the evening breeze carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The forest was quiet, the sounds of the day fading into the hush of twilight. She reached the rusted iron gates, the boundary between her world and Rhys's. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed them open and stepped through. She found him at the shrine, the same place where they had first met. He was standing in the center of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the setting sun, his silhouette stark against the fiery sky. He looked lost, lonely, burdened. He sensed her presence and turned, his golden eyes meeting hers. He didn't speak, didn't move. He simply waited, his expression guarded. Kasia walked towards him, her steps slow and deliberate. She stopped a few feet away, the letter still clutched in her hand. "I found something," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart. "In my mother's things." A letter from Alaric Blackwood. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. He knew. He knew what the letter contained. It talks about the pact, she continued. About the sacrifice. About the blood bond. He nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. It also talks about a way out, he said, his voice low. Love, Kasia whispered, the word hanging in the air between them. A true love, a selfless love stronger than the curse. He looked at her then, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "Do you believe it's possible?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kasia hesitated. She wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. But the fear, the doubts, the legacy of betrayal, they were all still there, a shadow between them. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "But I want to try. I want to believe." She held out the letter, offering it to him. He took it, his fingers brushing hers, sending a jolt of warmth through her. He unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. He read it in silence, his expression changing with each word. Hope, yes, but also sadness. Regret. The weight of his ancestors' mistakes, the burden of the curse, seemed to settle upon him, a tangible force. He finished reading, his gaze fixed on the letter. He truly believed it, he said, his voice a low murmur. Alaric, he believed in the power of love, even after everything he had done. But he also warned, Kasia said, her voice steady, that the love must be pure, untainted, that any weakness would strengthen the curse. Rhys looked up at her then, his golden eyes searching hers. "And do you doubt us, Kasia?" he asked, his voice laced with a vulnerability that tore at her heart. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Something deeper. Something that was beginning to feel like love. I fear the curse, she admitted, her voice trembling. I fear the bond. I fear hurting you. Or you hurting me. He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her, a warmth that momentarily eased the chilling fear. And I fear failing you, he said, his voice a low rumble. I fear succumbing to the darkness. I fear losing you. His confession, his vulnerability, broke down the last of her defenses. She saw him then, not as a monster, not as a Blackwood, not as a werewolf, but as a man. A man burdened by a legacy he hadn't chosen, a man struggling to break free, a man capable of love. She leaned into his touch, her hand reaching up to cover his. We can do this, Rhys, she said, her voice stronger now, filled with a newfound conviction. Together, we can fight the curse. We can find a way. He smiled then, a genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that transformed his face. It was a smile of hope, of love. He lowered his head and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss, a kiss that spoke of a promise, a commitment to beginning. It was a kiss that sealed their pact, not the pact of Alaric Blackwood, but their own pact. A pact made not in darkness, but in the fading light of the setting sun. A pact made not in fear, but in hope. A pact made in love. The question remained, though, if this fragile feeling could truly be enough to break the chains of a far older, darker agreement. Chapter 15. Running from Destiny's Embrace. The kiss, a fragile promise of hope and love, lingered on Kasia's lips, a stark contrast to the growing unease that gnawed at her. The setting sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest shrouded in twilight, the shadows deepening, mirroring the doubts that crept back into her mind. Could their love, still nascent and untested, truly overcome the centuries-old curse? Alaric Blackwood's letter offered a glimmer of hope, but it also demanded a purity, a selflessness, that seemed impossible. She pulled away from Rhys, her gaze shifting from his face to the darkening forest around them. The beauty of the twilight, the hush of the evening, felt menacing. The hunt, the full moon, the sacrifice, they were all still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I need to go, she said, her voice trembling, her hand instinctively reaching for the silver locket around her neck. Rhys nodded slowly, his expression understanding, but his golden eyes flickering with a hint of disappointment. He didn't try to stop her, didn't try to pressure her. He respected her need for space, for time to process. I'll walk with you, he said, his voice low. Kasia shook her head. No, she said. I need to be alone. To think. She turned and walked away, her pace quickening with each step, her heart pounding in her chest. She was running, not from Rhys, but from destiny, from the bond, from the fear. She reached the rusted iron gates, the boundary between the Blackwood estate and her mother's cottage. She didn't look back. She pushed open the gates and stepped through, entering the familiar world of her childhood, a world that now felt alien. She reached the cottage, fumbled with the key, and stumbled inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling. She was safe physically, but the turmoil within her, the conflicting emotions, the uncertainty, it all raged on, unchecked. She walked over to the window, drawing the curtains, shutting out the twilight, shutting out the world. She felt a desperate need for escape, for oblivion, She went to the small, antique cabinet where her mother had kept her liquor. She rarely drank, but tonight, she needed something to numb the fear, to quiet the doubts, to silence the wolf within her. She found a bottle of whiskey, unopened, tucked away in the back of the cabinet. She grabbed it, her hands shaking, and poured herself a large glass. She didn't bother with ice, didn't bother with water. She simply drank, the burning liquid scorching her throat, a welcome distraction from the turmoil within. She drank another glass, and another, the whiskey dulling her senses, blurring the edges of reality. She felt a numbness spreading through her, a false sense of calm. She sat down in the worn armchair by the fireplace, the bottle of whiskey on the table beside her, her mother's journal lying forgotten on the floor. She closed her eyes, trying to escape the thoughts, the memories, the fear. But it was no use. The images, the words, the feelings, they all came flooding back, amplified by the alcohol, distorted by the darkness. She saw Reese, his golden eyes filled with hope and love. She saw her father, Liam, his face fading in the silver locket. She saw Alaric Blackwood, his eyes haunted by regret and despair. She saw the full moon, its silvery light bathing the forest in an ethereal glow. She felt the pull, the transformation, the beast within her, stirring, awakening. She felt the bond, the connection to Reese, a thread of light in the darkness, a fragile hope threatened by the curse. She felt the fear, the doubts, the betrayal all swirling within her, a vortex of emotions that threatened to consume her. She cried, silent tears streaming down her face, the whiskey burning in her throat, the pain overwhelming. She was lost, adrift, caught in a storm she couldn't control, a destiny she couldn't escape. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in her drunken stupor, her mind a whirlwind of darkness and despair. But eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into a fitful, dream-ridden sleep. The dreams were vivid, terrifying, filled with images of wolves, of full moons, of blood. She was running, always running, pursued by a shadow, a hunter. She was trapped, bound, sacrificed. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat. The cottage was dark, the only light filtering through a crack in the curtains. She was disoriented, confused, her head throbbing, her stomach churning. She sat up, her hand reaching for the bottle of whiskey, but she stopped herself. She couldn't escape this. Not with alcohol, not with oblivion. She had to face it. She had to fight. She looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was almost midnight. The full moon. It was time. She took a deep breath. It was time to find out where she stood. Chapter 16. The gathering storm within. The clock ticked, each second a hammer blow against the fragile silence of the cottage. Midnight. The full moon. Kasia rose from the armchair, her body stiff and aching, her head throbbing from the after effects of the whiskey. But beneath the physical discomfort, a different kind of ache pulsed, a primal stirring, a wildness. She walked over to the window, her hand reaching for the curtain, hesitation warring with a strange, compelling urge. She shouldn't look. Her mother's warnings echoed in her mind, the ingrained fear of a lifetime. But she had to. She had to face it. She pulled back the curtain, a sliver of silvery light spilling into the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She gazed out at the full moon, its luminous glow bathing the forest in an ethereal light. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and terrifying. She felt it then, a surge of power, coursing through her veins, tingling in her fingertips, prickling her skin. It wasn't just fear. It was something else. Something exhilarating. Something wild. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, a stranger in her own skin. Her eyes, they were different. Brighter, sharper, with a hint of gold. Her senses felt heightened. The scent of the forest, the rustling of the leaves, the distant howl of a wolf all amplified, intensified.
The howl.
It resonated deep within her, a primal call that stirred something ancient and powerful within her soul. It was a call of belonging, of connection, of the hunt. She felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing her towards the forest, towards the moon, towards Reese. She wanted to resist, to fight it, but the urge was overwhelming, a primal instinct that bypassed logic and reason. She turned away from the window, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to control it. She couldn't transform. Not here.
Not now.
She stumbled back to the armchair, her hand reaching for the silver locket around her neck. She clutched it, the cool metal a grounding force against the rising tide of wildness. She closed her eyes, focusing on the image of her father, Liam, on the memory of Reese's kiss, on the fragile hope of love. She repeated a mantra in her mind, a desperate plea for control. I am Kasha Wren. I am human. I am in control. The words felt hollow, unconvincing. The wolf within her was stirring, awakening, demanding to be released. She could feel the changes, subtle but undeniable. Her muscles tensing, her senses sharpening, her instincts taking over. She fought it, clinging to her humanity, to her sanity, with every ounce of strength she possessed. She focused on her breathing, slowing it down, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. The struggle raged within her, a battle between two worlds, between two natures, between human and wolf. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, exhausting battle, and she didn't know how long she could sustain it. She heard a scratching at the door, a gentle, insistent sound that cut through the internal turmoil. She knew who it was. Reese. She didn't want to open the door. She was afraid of what she might do, afraid of what she might become. But she couldn't leave him out there, in the moonlight, alone. She rose from the armchair, her legs shaky, her body trembling. She walked towards the door, her hand reaching for the lock, hesitation warring with obligation, with love. She hesitated with her fingers inches from the knob, feeling her heartbeat increase and hearing the scratching grow in its urgency. He knew she was there. He also knew what she was becoming, and yet, she was not alone. She took a deep breath, steeling her resolve. She had to face it. She had to face him. She had to face herself. She unlocked the door and opened it. Chapter 17. Revelation in the Ruins. Reese stood on the porch, bathed in the silvery light of the full moon. He looked different. The transformation was further along than the last time she had seen him under the moon's influence. Taller, more muscular, his features sharper, his golden eyes glowing with an almost supernatural intensity. He was magnificent and terrifying, but there was something else in his eyes, too. Concern, worry, and love. It was that love, that fragile thread of connection, that gave Kasha the strength to not run. Kasha, he said, his voice a low rumble, strained with the effort of control. Are you all right? She couldn't answer, not with words. Her throat was tight, her voice trapped within her. She could feel the wolf, struggling to break free, to take over. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear, and something else. Something wilder, something untamed. Reese understood. He could see the changes in her, the subtle shifts in her features, the golden glow in her eyes. He could feel the power emanating from her, the awakening of the wolf. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face. He didn't touch her, not yet. He was giving her a choice, a chance to pull back. Don't be afraid, he said, his voice a soothing balm against the rising tide of panic. I'm here. I won't let anything happen to you. His words, his presence, his love, they were an anchor, a lifeline in the swirling chaos of her transformation. She focused on him, on his eyes, on his voice, on his strength. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart, trying to control the beast within. It was a struggle, a battle against her own nature, but she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't succumb. I can't control it, she whispered, her voice trembling, her words barely audible. Reese nodded, his expression understanding. I know, he said. It's the full moon. It amplifies the power. It calls to the wolf. He took a step closer, his hand still hovering near her face. "Let me help you," he said. "Let me guide you." She hesitated, fear warring with trust. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? Could she surrender to the transformation, to the wolf, without losing herself completely? She looked into his eyes, his golden eyes, and saw love. Unconditional love. Acceptance. Understanding. And strength. She nodded, a silent surrender, a fragile trust. He touched her then, his fingertips brushing against her cheek, sending a jolt of electricity through her. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was something more. A connection. A merging. A bond. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle.
"Come with me," he said.
"There's a safe place where we can ride out the moon." He led her away from the cottage, away from the familiar world of her human life, towards the Blackwood estate, towards the forest, towards the unknown. They walked in silence, their hands clasped together, their bodies close, their souls intertwined. Kasia could feel the changes accelerating, the transformation taking hold. Her senses sharpened, her muscles tensed, her instincts heightened. She could smell the rich, earthy scent of the forest, the damp leaves, the pine needles. She could hear the rustling of the wind, the hooting of an owl, the howling of wolves. The howling resonated deep within her, a primal call that both terrified and exhilarated her. It was a call of belonging, of home. They reached the clearing where the abandoned shrine stood, the stone walls bathed in the silvery moonlight. It was a place of power, a place of magic, a place of transformation. Rhys stopped in the center of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the moon. He turned to Kasia, his golden eyes blazing with an intensity that mirrored her own. "This is where it began," he said, his voice a low rumble, his words barely audible above the howling. "And this is where it will end, or begin anew." He released her hand, a subtle shift that left her feeling strangely bereft. He took a step back, giving her space. "Let it go, Kasia," he said, his voice a soothing balm against the rising tide of wildness. "Don't fight it. Embrace it. Become who you were meant to be." He closed his eyes, his body beginning to tremble. He was transforming, fully, completely. The changes rippled through him, his bones shifting, his muscles expanding, his form changing. Kasia watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She was witnessing something extraordinary, something terrifying, something beautiful. And then she felt it. The final surrender. The release. The wolf. It burst forth, a surge of power, a wave of freedom, a transformation. She felt her bones shift, her muscles contract, her form change. She was no longer Kasia Wren, the librarian, the woman afraid of her own shadow. She was something else. Something wild. Something powerful. Something free. She looked at Rhys, no longer a man, but a magnificent wolf, his fur the color of midnight, his eyes glowing with the light of the moon. He was her mate, her equal, her destiny. There, under the full moon, two wolves stood howling in the ruins. It was not an end, but a terrifying, exhilarating beginning. Chapter 18. The Blood Moon's Promise. The howl echoed through the silent forest, a duet of wildness and freedom, a declaration of becoming. Kasia, no longer entirely human, stood on four paws, her fur the color of silvered moonlight, her eyes reflecting the celestial glow above. She felt alive. Truly, utterly alive. Rhys, a magnificent black wolf, stood beside her, his presence a grounding force, a comforting warmth in the exhilarating chaos of her transformation. He nudged her gently with his snout, a silent reassurance, a wordless communication that transcended human language. She responded in kind, nuzzling him back, her instincts taking over, her human mind receding, replaced by a primal awareness, a heightened sense of connection. She was wolf, and he was her mate. They ran through the moonlit forest, their paws silent on the damp earth, their bodies moving with a grace and power she had never known. It was a dance of freedom, a celebration of their true nature. She felt the wind in her fur, the scent of the earth, the thrill of the chase. She was no longer afraid. The fear had been replaced by exhilaration, by joy. They reached a clearing, a hidden glade bathed in the silvery light of the moon. A small, clear stream gurgled through the center, its waters reflecting the celestial glow. It was a place of peace, of tranquility, of magic. Reese stopped by the stream, his gaze fixed on the moon. He looked at Kasha, his golden eyes still golden, even in wolf form filled with a question. She understood. The bond. The sacrifice.
The pact.
It was time. She approached him, her movements slow and deliberate, her wolf heart pounding in her chest. She nuzzled him again, a silent affirmation, a promise. He lowered his head, his breath warm on her fur. He licked her cheek, a gentle, tender gesture that sent a wave of love through her. It was a love that transcended words, a love that transcended form. It was a soul connection, a primal bond. He shifted then, a ripple of movement passing through his body, his form changing. He was no longer wolf, but man. Reese. Naked, vulnerable, and beautiful. He stood before her, bathed in the moonlight, his golden eyes fixed on hers. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her fur. Kasha, he whispered, his voice a low rumble, a sound that resonated deep within her soul. Are you ready? She hesitated, a flicker of her human mind surfacing, a whisper of doubt. But it was fleeting, quickly overwhelmed by the primal urge, by the bond, by the love. She stepped forward, her head brushing against his hand. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the transformation, to the wolf, to the destiny that awaited her. His touch sent a wave of warmth through her, a warmth that melted the last vestiges of fear. I love you, Kasha Wren, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, his golden eyes shining with a love that transcended time and space. And I love you, Reese Blackwood, she whispered back, her voice trembling, her heart overflowing with a love she had never thought possible. He kissed her then, a deep, passionate kiss, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that fulfilled the pact. It was a kiss that transformed them, not physically, but spiritually. It was a kiss that healed. As they kissed, the moon above them seemed to shift. It grew larger, brighter, its silvery light turning a deep, blood red. The blood moon. A symbol of transformation, of sacrifice, of promise. The curse was not broken, not entirely, but it was changed, transformed. The power of their love, the purity of their bond, had altered the ancient pact. It had weakened the darkness, strengthened the light. They were still bound, to each other, to the moon, to the wolf. But they were no longer victims. They were masters of their own destiny. They had found a way to coexist, to control the power, to embrace their dual nature, to love. The blood moon hung heavy in the sky, a reminder that choices had been made. What would the new dawn bring? Chapter 19. Sacrifice and Redemption. The blood moon cast an eerie, crimson glow over the clearing, bathing the two lovers in its otherworldly light. The kiss had ended, but the connection, the bond, remained, stronger than ever, a palpable force that hummed between them. They stood, naked and vulnerable, yet empowered by the love that had transformed the ancient curse. But the transformation wasn't complete. Kasha could feel it, a lingering unease, a whisper of darkness that still clung to the edges of their newfound peace. The pact, though altered, still demanded a sacrifice. Not of their lives, not of their love, but of something else. Reese sensed her unease, his golden eyes searching hers, filled with a mixture of love and concern. What is it, Kasha? He asked, his voice a low rumble, his hand gently stroking her hair. It's not over, she whispered, her voice trembling, her gaze fixed on the blood moon. The pact, it still demands something. He nodded slowly, his expression grave. He knew. He had always known. The true sacrifice wasn't the blood bond itself, but the surrender of their individual power, the merging of their souls, to create something new, something stronger. "We have to give it what it wants," he said, his voice laced with a reluctant acceptance. "We have to complete the transformation." Kasha understood. They had to relinquish their separate identities, their human and wolf selves, and merge them, to become one, a unified being, neither fully human nor fully wolf, but something more. It was a terrifying prospect. To lose herself, to lose her individuality, to cease to exist as Kasha Wren. But it was also exhilarating. To become something greater. To transcend the limitations of their separate forms. To achieve true unity.
"How?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. Reese smiled, a sad, tender smile that reached his eyes. "Together," he said. "As always." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. He led her to the center of the clearing, to the spot where the stream gurgled, its waters reflecting the blood-red moon. "We have to surrender," he said. "To the moon, to the bond, to each other. We have to let go." He closed his eyes, his body beginning to tremble. He was initiating the final transformation, the merging of their souls. Kasha closed her eyes, too, her hand tightly clasped in his. She focused on her love for him, on the bond that connected them, on the hope for a future free from the curse. She surrendered. To the moon, to the power, to Reese. She let go of her fear, her doubts, her individual self. She felt a surge of energy, a wave of power, coursing through her veins, tingling in her fingertips, prickling her skin. It was overwhelming, exhilarating,
Terrifying.
She felt herself changing. Not physically, not this time, but internally. Her mind, her soul, was merging with Reese's. Their thoughts, their feelings, their memories all blending together, becoming one. She saw through his eyes, felt his emotions, experienced his past. She saw the centuries of struggle, the burden of the curse, the loneliness, the longing. She saw his love for her, a love that transcended time and space, a love that had saved him. And he saw through her eyes, felt her emotions, experienced her past. He saw the years of running, the fear, the loneliness, the yearning. He saw her love for him, a love that had awakened him, a love that had healed him. They were one, a unified being, a fusion of two souls, a perfect balance of human and wolf, of darkness and light. The blood moon above them began to fade, its crimson glow softening, returning to its silvery, luminous state. The transformation was complete. The sacrifice had been made. The pact had been fulfilled. And redeemed. They opened their eyes, their gazes locking, their souls merged. They were no longer Kasha Wren and Reese Blackwood. They were something else. Something new. Something more. They were one. They smiled at each other and, hand in hand, walked toward the sunrise. What would their future hold? Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts. Hand in hand, they walked towards the sunrise, the nascent light painting the sky with hues of hope and renewal. They were one, yet two distinct individuals within that unified consciousness. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace, of completeness, of belonging. But even in this newfound serenity, a nagging awareness lingered. The world outside their bond remained, with its prejudices, its fears, and its dangers. They returned to the cottage, the familiar surroundings a stark contrast to the extraordinary transformation they had undergone. The scent of lavender and old books, the faded floral wallpaper, the worn armchair by the fireplace, it all felt different now. Seen through new eyes, felt with a unified soul. As they stood in the center of the living room, the rising sun streaming through the windows, they heard a noise. A scratching at the door. Not the gentle, insistent sound of Reese from the previous night, but a frantic, desperate clawing. They exchanged a look, their unified consciousness instantly recognizing the threat. It wasn't Reese, not this time. It was something else. Something hostile. Reese, the Reese aspect of their unified being, took the lead, his protective instincts surging. He moved towards the door, his senses heightened, his body tensed, ready for confrontation. The Kasha aspect followed close behind, her own instincts, now intertwined with Reese's, warning her of danger. But there was no fear, not anymore. Only determination. Reese reached the door, his hand hovering over the lock. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever lay beyond. He unlocked the door and flung it open. Standing on the porch, bathed in the golden light of the rising sun, were 3 figures. 2 men and a woman, all dressed in dark, practical clothing, their faces grim, their eyes filled with hatred. They were hunters. Not the mystical hunt that had brought Kasha and Reese together, but the humankind. The ones who hunted werewolves, the ones who feared the different, the ones who clung to old prejudices, old hatreds. The woman, the leader of the group, stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Reese, her hand resting on the weapon at her hip. A silver-tipped crossbow. "Reese Blackwood," she said, her voice cold and hard, her words laced with venom. "We've been looking for you." Reese didn't speak. He simply stood there, his body a shield between Kasha and the hunters, his golden eyes, their golden eyes, blazing with defiance. "We know what you are," the woman continued, her gaze shifting to Kasha, her expression filled with disgust. "And we know what you've done. You've corrupted her. Bound her to you. With your curse." Kasha stepped forward, standing beside Reese, her hand reaching for his, their fingers intertwining. "I am not corrupted," she said, her voice steady, her words filled with a newfound strength, a unified power. "I am whole. I am one with him."
By choice.
The woman scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "Choice?" she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You have no choice. You are tainted. You are one of them. A monster." "We are not monsters," Reese said, his voice a low rumble, his words filled with a controlled fury. "We are different, but we are not evil." The woman laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that echoed in the morning air. "Different?" she repeated. "Evil? You are an abomination. A threat to humanity. You must be eliminated." She raised her crossbow, aiming it directly at Reese's heart. The 2 men flanking her followed suit, their own weapons drawn, their faces grim, their intentions clear. Kasha and Reese stood firm, their hands clasped together, their souls merged. They were not afraid. They were ready. They had faced the darkness within themselves, the curse, the transformation. They had found love. They had found unity. They had found peace. And now, they would face the darkness without. Together. As one. But what they weren't prepared for was when the woman looked Kasha in the eyes and whispered mother. The world shifted. The final confrontation would not be with weapons, but with the deepest, most complex bonds of the heart. Epilogue. Mother. The word, whispered with a chilling blend of accusation and recognition, shattered the fragile peace, the unified resolve. Kasha stared at the woman, the hunter, her mind reeling, her heart their heart constricting with a pain that transcended even the fear of death. The woman's face, etched with lines of hatred and grief, was familiar. The eyes, though hardened by years of prejudice and loss, held a flicker of Alara, her mother. But that was impossible. Alara was dead, wasn't she? The woman Mara, Kasha's mind supplied, a name dredged from the depths of a shared memory, a memory that was both hers and not hers, took a step forward, her crossbow lowered slightly, her gaze fixed on Kasha's face. "Don't you recognize me, Kasha?" Mara asked, her voice trembling, her words laced with a desperate plea for understanding. "It's me, your sister." "Sister?" Kasha, they reeled. Sister? Alara had never mentioned a sister. Had she? The memories, fragmented and distorted by the merging, by the curse, by the years, were unclear. The Reese aspect tightened his grip on Kasha's hand, his presence a grounding force, a silent support. He sensed the turmoil within her, within them. He knew. He had always known. The truth about Alara's past, the secrets she had kept, the family she had left behind. Mara Reese said, his voice a low rumble, his words carefully chosen. Alara, she wanted to protect Kasha. From this.
From you.
Mara scoffed, her eyes narrowing, her gaze shifting to Reese, her expression filled with hatred. Protect her? She repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She corrupted her. Turned her into one of you. A monster. I am not a monster. Kasha, they said, her voice steady, her words filled with a newfound conviction, a unified strength. I am who I choose to be. And I choose love. I choose unity. I choose Reese. Mara's face contorted with rage, her hand tightening on the crossbow. You are a fool, Kasha, she said, her voice shaking. You are deluded. He has bewitched you. He has stolen your soul. No, Reese said, his voice firm, his golden eyes blazing with defiance. We have found each other. We have merged. We are one. By choice. By love. Mara stared at them, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and despair. She saw the bond between them. The unity, the love. She saw the truth. And she broke. The crossbow slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground. The two men flanking her looked at her, their expressions confused, their weapons still raised, but their resolve faltering. Mara sank to her knees, her body shaking, her hands covering her face. She sobbed, a heart-wrenching sound that echoed in the morning air. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice broken, her words barely audible. I thought I was doing the right thing. Protecting humanity. Avenging Mother. Kasha, they felt a wave of compassion, a surge of empathy. She understood Mara's pain, her grief, her misguided hatred. It was a pain rooted in fear, in loss, in the lies she had been told. She knelt beside Mara, her hand reaching out, hesitantly, to touch her sister's shoulder. Mother, she lied to you. Mara, Kasha said, her voice gentle, her words filled with a shared sorrow. She lied to protect us both. From the truth. From the curse. From the hunt. Mara looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, her face streaked with tears. She stared at Kasha, at them. She saw the unity, the love, the truth. And she understood. The hatred, the prejudice, the fear, it all began to fade, replaced by a glimmer of acceptance. A flicker of hope. The two men, witnessing Mara's transformation, lowered their weapons, their expressions shifting from hostility to confusion. They, too, felt the shift, the change in the air. The sun rose higher in the sky, its golden light bathing the cottage in a warm, healing glow. The blood moon was a distant memory, a symbol of a past that had been redeemed. Kasha and Reese, unified in their love, in their being, stood together, facing Mara, facing the hunters, facing the future. The curse was not entirely gone. The wolf remained, a part of their essence. But it was no longer a source of darkness, of fear, of violence. It was a source of strength, of unity, of love. They had found a way to coexist, to control the power, to embrace their dual nature, to live in peace. The future was uncertain, yes, but they were no longer afraid. They were one, and they were ready. They had a long journey ahead of them, mending broken bonds, healing old wounds, bridging the gap between two worlds. But they had each other and a shared, infinite love. And that was all that mattered. The end.